Yeah. You've also written about the missed encounter, of politics that doesn't resolve into harmony or recognition. Could this be a better figure for solidarity, not as an emotional identification, but as something demanding, incomplete, non-sovereign?
Yes, I think that's, I didn't realize I'd said it. It sounds really good. And I would go with that, which is that a politics that seeks to reconcile opposition or disagreement in the name of consensus is a dominative gesture, right? It's not a solidarizing gesture. Particularly in the US, where consensus has been the hallmark of many powerful movements, including feminism, right? Where consensus was what feminists often set out as the goal of a particular orientation that saw itself as feminist. But what if we were to not necessarily reach for consensus, but recognize that disagreement is itself valuable, that disagreement has a political value and maybe a longer shelf life than something that can just be agreed upon very quickly in the name of consensus or agreement.
Yeah. Uh, no, that's really well said. In your earlier work, States of Exception, you write, the everyday is not a moral refuge, nor is it neutral. It is the scene of saturation. That line feels central to the stakes of internationalism too. How does your concept of everyday saturation reframe how we think about complicity, ethics, and solidarity, maybe?
Right. I mean, when I was writing that book, I was deeply influenced by Henri Lefebvre and his ideas about everyday life on the one hand. And I also wanted to be mindful of the kind of, what can I say, cautions that someone like Pierre Bourdieu offers to a field like anthropology or sociology. Cautions against validating the everyday simply as a terrain of truth or a terrain of experience that must be honored for its own sake. But experience is a very contradictory and contrary proposition, right? And I wanted to be mindful of the fact that when the people that were subjects of my first book, of the ethnography, the people that I studied and participated with and whom I engaged in that work, they were completely unself-conscious about what they were trying to do. And I'm not saying this to be condescending. It's the nature of experience that one doesn't necessarily think about it, uh, unless you are put in the position of reflection. Right? I mean, this is why Hegel has his various stages in the phenomenology of mind, right? I mean, experience has to move from sense perception to understanding to knowledge. You don't just have it because you experience something. So rather than validating the everyday for its own sake, I was trying to get at those folds of experience that, on the one hand, blinded people to their own prejudices, and on the other hand, also revealed something about how they struggle, um, as a diasporic community in the US, how they struggle with all of the practical daily conflicts that, at least in the East, was routine for South Asian immigrants to experience. Not that it's gone away, but now you have so many more prominent right-wing figures like Kash Patel or whatever, that South Asians have a certain kind of prominence in the public sphere, which will bring its own backlash as well, I'm sure. But at that moment, from the late 70s onwards, when the Johnson administration loosened immigration rules in this country, people came and were, completely misrecognized and misunderstood. And so I was trying to get at what accounts for those misunderstandings and how do people manage and navigate that, negotiate that in their own daily lives.
You
Was there,
also
I'm not
write
sure
that,
yeah,
sorry,
there was a question
sorry.
there, but I'm not sure I answered it.
I was just asking about everyday saturation and how that
Mhm.
reframes how we look at concepts such as complicity, ethics, or solidarity, and the significance of that work.
It's such uneven terrain, right? The everyday is such uneven terrain. People live at multiple levels, right? I mean, even in a very ordinary life, there are many different competing demands that could be folded into the category of one's everyday existence. And
Yeah.
how, in aspects of that, one might be complicit. In other aspects of it, one might be resistant, right, to the forms of power and authority that are constantly interpolating people into a particular understanding of what life should be, a normative understanding of what life should be. So the everyday becomes a kind of a wedge, in that production of normalcy and production of reified existence. And some people are much more attuned to the fact that they're constantly under a certain kind of assault. And other people are much more unself conscious about it. And in that book, I was trying to figure out what accounts for some forms of self consciousness and reflexivity that one could detect or sort of discern in everyday experience. On the other hand, what accounts for the kinds of closure or blind spots that equally inform and maybe even overwhelm our understanding of everyday life. But really, what I was trying to do in that book was contest the notion that there is such a thing as postcolonial identity in the singular. Now, obviously, that might seem kind of banal now, but to me at that point, it was important to try to disentangle because everyone was writing about postcolonial identity as though it was something that you could put your finger on. And my interest was in interrogating that very notion that there was such a thing as postcolonial identity. And I looked to the everyday to figure that out, to kind of symptomatize or diagnose that.
Yeah, and in that book, you also talk about how the everyday is shaped by repetition and crisis, but
Hmm.
repetition is often pathologized, right? It's like seen as this inertia, there's like apathy. But my question, I suppose, is that what kind of political attention does repetition demand from us, especially in a moment when we're always looking for ruptures? And those are the things that the spectacular event or like rupture is always romanticized.
Hmm. Right. When you are basically a worker under capital, it doesn't really matter. I mean, unless you're a kind of CEO or something, if you're a worker under capital at any level, you're involved in grunt work, in drudgery, right? And this is especially true of people who are, who were the folks that I was dealing with studying in that book. They're engineers or doctors or, you know, secretaries and a few lawyers, not that many. This was kind of the bulk of the subjects that I was dealing with in that book. And their lives are still, I would say, all our lives are comprised of, repetition, where there are just tasks that you have to get done. There are meetings one has to attend, right? There's a kind of a pattern of the everyday that becomes habitual and, in a sense, numbing. And I wanted to get at what are the kinds of flashpoints that make that, numbed existence kind of fall apart? What are the sort of trouble spots in that patterning of everyday life? The comfort that it brings, but also the unself consciousness that is required of some very, very smart people. And of course, they couldn't be unself conscious, completely unself conscious. So they resorted to, and I think you recognize this as a strategy that we all employ. I listen to old Hindi music when I'm feeling that, I need to get out of this country and get away from, you know,
Yeah.
uh, everything that surrounds me. Or I will, resort to listening to or even singing Robindra Sangeet, so Tagore music. So
Marx used to read Shakespeare.
exactly. So, and Goethe. So there are strategies that we all employ. And that is to me, a very key moment to recognize that people don't just live unself consciously, but that they also recognize those moments when the patterning, the routinization, the habitual needs to be disrupted or is disrupted by either consciously or unwittingly by people. It's a moment of both um, illumination. It's what Walter Benjamin once called profane illumination, right? It's
Mhm.
not the illumination of kind of a religious insight or epiphany, but an illumination that is produced by one's keen sensitivity or understanding of exactly how bad life is.
I really appreciated you. I appreciate how you explained that. Something that was also in the book, which I think was urgent across your work in general, is the idea of non-sovereignty, that political subjects are not the masters of their own circumstances, but they remain entangled, unfinished, or even incoherent.
Yeah.
And I was sort of wondering, how does this challenge frameworks that demand clarity from solidarity or otherwise?
Well, agency has become such a big word, right, in contemporary discourse and even contemporary political struggles. We're constantly finding agents here, there, and everywhere. But agency is a very complicated matter, and it's a very fraught and vexed matter. More often than not, people don't see themselves as agents. And to attribute agency to people who have none is, I think, a move in bad faith. And perhaps the term that has been most abused is the term subaltern or subalternity, where,
Mhm.
subalterns are mysteriously seen to have the kind of agency which, if they had, they would not be subalterns. So it's a kind of a logical impossibility, a logical contradiction. But it helps, it again, it romanticizes the subaltern by assigning to them an agency, a historical agency that they may or may not have had, more likely didn't. Uh, so once you ride that bandwagon of finding agents everywhere, historical agents everywhere, you are kind of already, I would say, destined to
Yeah.
get to a place where
Yeah,
incompleteness.
you write that the subject of the everyday is not the agent of history, but its
Right,
remainder, I think, in that book.
right,
And
right.
that remainder part is kind of interesting when you think about some of the work that other critical scholars have done, who have talked about the body or like endurance, say like Paganelli or these sort of scholars. And you're
Mhm.
coming at it from a different set of theoretical apparatus. And I found that very fascinating to read, coming from a Marxist intellectual who isn't over determining different ideas of
Right.
the state and, looking at how these things work in the everyday. And I think that's very relevant today. So I want to conclude the interview by returning to like the moment we're in right now. How might one stay committed to Palestine or these questions of abolition, decolonization, while refusing to perform innocence and without retreating into the irony or inaction? And I have another question, just like where is your work leading to, and are you working on any current projects? What are those
Right.
questions intellectually and then on that level?
I would say that when it comes to Palestine, I've learned the most from the students who have organized the protests and been at the forefront. I don't think it's us, meaning professors or faculty who can claim any particular role of leadership. I think the students have taught us how solidarity happens. If you just look at the portrait, I don't know, I can't remember offhand the name of the documentary that was done on the Columbia student protest movement. I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about. Do you remember the title of that film?
Oh no, I forgot the title, but I know what you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah. So, how important it was to see people who have adopted this particular crusade of trying to get attention to the genocide that is ongoing now, but also the history of Palestinian dispossession and all of the risks that they've taken, including by getting their visas revoked, their degrees not given, imprisoned, deported, so on. These are huge risks that people are taking on a daily basis. I'm moved and inspired by that. But
Yeah.
what it means is that, for me, it just simply means that you have to understand suffering, that suffering is a universal thing. It doesn't belong, there's no, what was it that Camus once said? There is no algebra of blood. It's not that we can get involved in calculations about whose people shed more blood.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then again you fall into the kind of chosen people syndrome. And
Hmm.
I think that's catastrophic. So, what inspires me about the student movements is precisely that there is no kind of a calculus of priorities. It's just a very universal kind of statement of solidarity with people who are being killed and, whose lives are being destroyed, whose homes have been demolished, and so on, without necessarily feeling any personal, implication in that.
Yeah.
That's a very concrete example of how solidarity can work and has worked and is working. And that's why it's so dangerous to power. It's
Yeah.
not for nothing that this particular set of student protests have become such a nightmare for institutions. Of course, they're returning it with their own nightmares that they're imposing on people. But I think that gives me hope for what
Yeah.
is perhaps possible down the road, although obviously there's a lot more bloodshed that evidently is going to happen before we get to the other side.
Yeah. And just a final question about your intellectual pursuits, upcoming
Right,
works,
yes.
things that you're working on currently, any anything
Right.
of that
Right
nature.
now I'm trying to finish a book on the early 20th century revolutionary and leader of the Indian nationalist movement, Aurobindo Ghosh. So Aurobindo, of course, becomes subsequently a rishi and, moves to Pondicherry and becomes a kind of a mystic and a sage and, you know, a yogi. I'm not interested so much in that part of his life because I don't really know that much about. I couldn't take a stand on. I wouldn't be able to explicate his philosophies of yoga and so on. But I
Mhm.
am interested in the reasons why he has been subordinated, if you will, in the narrative of Indian nationalism by figures like Nehru and Gandhi.
Can you tell a little bit about him as a figure and what his significance was and those things?
So before he came on to the scene, I mean, it's a very curious and very interesting story of a highly anglicized elite man born into a family. His father was a doctor in the imperial government and the imperial services. And when he was born, his father was, the model, the kind of Macaulay model of the hunting, fishing, shooting kind of Indian gentleman, right? So he was sent off at the age of 7 to live in England. And he went to public school there. He went to Cambridge. And there he was politicized. He was already politicized a little bit before then, it appears, but really his kind of awakening, if you will, happened when he was a student at Cambridge. And his father's dream for him was that he would become an ICS, an Indian civil servant, Indian civil
Yeah.
service officer. So he sat for the exam. He did very well, but failed to show up for the riding requirement because at that point ICS officers had to be able to demonstrate their riding capacities, because I guess you had to ride
Yeah.
around in the districts,
Yeah.
to make sure that everything was copacetic or whatever. um,
Hmm.
but by this time, he also didn't want to be part of the ICS because he saw it just as a kind of a being a kind of a toady to the imperial government. And he returned to India and became a kind of a first a professor, but also the secretary to the Gaikwad, the Maharaja of Baroda, and subsequently moved back to Calcutta. Now, keep in mind, this is a man who didn't even know any Bengali. He didn't speak it very well, and he certainly couldn't read or write it. His
Hmm.
father had banned the speaking of Bengali at home. So, how does a person like this become the kind of galvanizing force for the anti colonial movement? That's a very interesting question that I'm trying to explore. The other is that before he came on the scene, it's not that there were no anti colonial disruptions or mobilizations, there were. But it's the moment that gives us the shift from anti colonial agitation to the nationalist movement. So the organization of anti colonial struggle into a nationalist political movement, that's something that everybody attributes to him, although it's something that has not become not really so prominent anymore in the story of Indian nationalist historiography. So I'm trying to write about that because I find it fascinating.